Hello viewers, 4DIYers here with another tutorial video for everyone. In this particular video here, I'll be doing a demonstration on basic rust repair. Show your support by hitting that subscribe button and help promote my channel by sharing your favorite videos on your social media pages. Here I am working with a component off a snowblower, but this procedure does apply to any steel components found on vehicles, recreational vehicles, etc. I will not be covering how to repair any soft, rotten, or metals with holes in this video. That will be saved for a future tutorial video. When you first get into a rusted area, you won't always know its structural situation until the rust and paint has been removed from the area. If the rusted area is next to a body panel seam or trim, there's a very good chance it continues within that seam or under the trim. A rust spot may appear to be only 2 inches across, but when in reality it's actually 4 inches across, as the corrosion can migrate under the paint even though it hasn't been bubbled up. Start by masking off the adjacent areas with tape and paper. This is specifically directed towards spot repairs. This will add a little protection from the dust or whatever equipment we are using, as it may slip and damage the surrounding paint. Normally I like to start out with a scraper to remove any loose debris such as flaking paint or rust. If it is soft, you should hear some crunching or cracking sounds. If you push on it hard enough, well, your finger will be able to push through. At the point where you do find a soft spot, well, it may appear to be disappointing at first, but if you did apply filler, it would eventually fall apart. You do have a few different options on how to remove or neutralize the rust. This is a must, otherwise the rust will come back, creating bubbling in your finished surface along with deteriorating the metal in behind. Be sure to check out my video on the 4 different ways to remove rust at home. I'll include the link in the description below. Depending on what method you do use, ensure it is dry and free of any moisture. Then sand the area down with 180 to 220 grit sandpaper. I would highly recommend wearing gloves. This will prevent the oil from your skin contaminating the area and any harsh chemicals coming in contact with your skin. After that, give the area a good wipe down with a wax and grease remover. Use only a wax and grease remover, as it doesn't leave any residue behind where it can affect adhesion or final paint finish, and doesn't evaporate too fast where you have to worry about it missing any contaminants. Wait until the surface is dry, then apply primer. The best option for primer is a 2-part epoxy, but unfortunately that can be hard to find and is more expensive. However, it does have the best moisture resistance and adhesion. Instead, I will be using a method with etching primer. Mix the can accordingly and then apply the etching primer to the surface. Work in a well-ventilated area, and I would highly recommend wearing a respirator as well. Considering we are working outdoors, there is a very good chance we will get dust in the paint. Therefore, I like to wet the ground first with water if possible to prevent any dust from floating, along with painting on days with minimal wind. The etching primer does contain acid which bites into the metal surface, creating a stronger bond and neutralizing the rust to some extent. This is also a high build primer, which means it will fill any imperfections in the surface such as metal pitting or scratches. Apply a second coat. If you are working with a spot repair on a vehicle's body panel, you will want to feather in the edge of the paint. If you do leave a hard edge, this will be much harder to blend afterwards. Make sure the metal does have a sufficient coating with no bare spots exposed. Lighter coats are best as it does dry quicker. Wait about 10 minutes in between coats. So you will probably be looking for 2 to 3 coats depending on your workpiece and the extent of the surface imperfections. Allow it to dry for about an hour. Considering this was a high build primer, there is no need for any additional type of high build primer. If you are only able to find an etching primer, use a high build primer over top of the etching primer and ensure both products are compatible. As a tip, touch the tape to ensure the primer has dried and is hard enough to work with. Keep in mind, primer does not seal the surface. Primer is porous, therefore it will allow moisture in, causing the metal to rust afterwards. Whatever you are working on, take the correct measures to prevent moisture exposure. Now apply a guide coat. Here I'm using a very light mist of compatible darker colored primer. There is actually a specific product to apply for a guide coat, but it can be hard to find depending on where you live. A guide coat is intended to show you the high and low spots of the surface, along with where you have and haven't sanded. If these low spots aren't addressed, they will show up in the final finish. Depending on the severity of the surface, you may need to start out with 220 to 320 grit sandpaper. This may seem coarse, but at the moment I am trying to rough out the surface first, leveling it quickly to remove any imperfections. Use the assistance of a backing pad or block to keep the sandpaper even so it does not create any distortion in the surface. This will level out a majority of the surface, bringing the high spots down to meet the low areas. Using this illustration of how the guide coat works. We have dimpling along the metal surface, creating low spots. The primer is sprayed on, providing an added layer, but doesn't necessarily level out those imperfections. The guide coat adds another layer, very light, over the whole object. Once we start sanding, the sandpaper is in contact with the high areas, but not the low areas. The low spots being the pitting from the rusting. After significant sanding, this high primer will eventually cut down, leveling the surface. Once you are satisfied, apply another coat of primer, which will provide a coating over the exposed metal and create a smooth surface. If you get into excessively low areas, a filler can be used called glazing putty. Considering the pitting is only shallow, I won't be using it, and we'll get more in depth with how to use glazing putty in a future video. Finally, apply another coat of etching primer to the bare metal and over the areas we have sanded. Considering the 220 to 320 was coarse sandpaper, it wouldn't give you a quality final finish, therefore the scratches will need to be filled. Take your time, always inspecting the area. Prep work is extremely important as it does greatly affect the final finish. No metal must be exposed before applying paint. If pitting still needs to be filled, continue the previous steps with primer and sanding to remove any imperfections. Once satisfied, finish up with either 400 or 600 grit sandpaper. 400 grit is directed towards non-metallic paints and 600 is better for metallic paints. Do not use anything coarser than 400 grit as this will leave deep imperfections and will be noticeable in the final finish. Sanding is needed again to remove any dust that may have landed in the surface and remove any orange peel which will be magnified in the final coat. Here I am using sandpaper made by Mutter, which is available in a variety of grits. I currently have the variety pack, which starts out at 400 and goes all the way up to 3000 grit. It can be used either wet or dry, is silicone carbide, and is electro coated. The link to the product will be included in the description below, which is available on Amazon. For the inside, I did not level the surface, just to demonstrate the difference between filling surface pitting and not. Inside I am using a scuffing pad which is rated at 400 grit. The scuffing pad is used to gain access to those low areas. Sandpaper would be unable to do this. Therefore the scuffing pad does promote an uneven surface which will not remove surface imperfections unlike sandpaper. Wipe down the area again with wax and grease remover. If the contaminants are not removed, this will create fisheye, adhesion problems, paint separation, and other flaws. Once the degreaser has evaporated, a tack cloth can be used to remove any dust or lint on the surface, which is normally stuck on from static. I'm just using a standard off-the-shelf gloss black paint here. For paint choices, you have a couple different choices from a spray can, single stage or two stage. Normally I purchase a single stage paint from a local auto parts supplier, which can be mixed in a custom color that matches my vehicle. The single stage does come in acrylic enamel. There is no need for clear coat, can be a little harder to blend, and isn't as durable. There is a two-stage paint as well, which will have a base coat and a clear coat that is required. Just like paint, there is a couple options for clear coat too. You will have a 1K or 2K clear. 2K is the best as it's very durable and user-friendly. 2 to 4 coats are required depending on the thickness of paint applied and if you plan on wet sanding the piece afterwards. I won't be wet sanding this piece, so first will be a light coat, then a medium coat, and then a full wet coat. When painting a vehicle, it is extremely important to mask off any other areas of the vehicle, even go to the extent of covering up the vehicle with a tarp or some type of cover. Overspray can hang around for quite a while depending on the paint and can be very hard to clean up afterwards. Once satisfied, allow the paint to dry. Dry times will vary on the climate, product, and thickness of coats. When the paint is curing or hardening, do not allow any moisture to come in contact with it. If morning dew hits the piece, the paint will go from a gloss to a cloudy finish which cannot be buffed out afterwards in most cases. Therefore it will need to be redone. Don't be too anxious with touching the surface to test if the paint is dry either. I found myself doing this many times in the past. As a tip, touch the tape of an area containing paint to determine if it's dry or not. With regards to masking off areas, within about 30 minutes of your final coat, remove the tape which will be against the painted surface. While the paint is fresh, it will slightly flow, minimizing a hard edge. This also prevents the paint from peeling up when removing the tape when it's completely dry. After that, you should be left with something such as this. As for wet sanding, depending on the paint, I normally like to wait about a week. I will include a tutorial on how to wet sand paint in the description below. The outside surface was smoothened as you can see previously, the inside was not, so you can see the difference between the two finishes. When painting outside, dust in the paint can be expected as it's not a controlled environment. Sometimes the dust can be removed by wet sanding, depending on how deep it sits in the surface. New videos are being uploaded every week to my channel, so show your support by hitting that subscribe button below my video. Don't forget to give me a thumbs up, and if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to post them. Thank you for watching.